Okay, so welcome everyone to today's New York State TESOL webinar. We are so excited to invite Dr. Mary Jane Curry, who is at the University of Rochester, and she's going to be talking about academic literacies in higher education with English language learners. But it takes a few minutes to get used to using the Zoom. We want to make sure everyone can hear well, etc. So if you can hover somewhere, maybe on the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a chat feature. So if you click the chat box, it should pop up and you'll be able to see my group chat, which said welcome. Make sure you turn off your video and your audio because it is a lot easier for us to manage. There's a lot of people here online. So if you can just type into the chat box, where are you dialing in from today? Are you in New York City? Are you in, we saw some interesting places. Are you in Saigon? Where are you? So, wow, look at this, Binghamton, Rochester, Tampa, Vermont, the Bronx, China. Welcome. Wow, we're so excited. The Ukraine, New Jersey, but originally from Rochester. That was important. Vancouver, Armenia, Morocco. Amazing. This is fabulous. This is the beauty of technology. So we're just going to give people another couple of moments before we get started so that we can begin our session all together. So continue to take a look at where everyone is from and post where you are dialing in from. We have already over 50 people on the line, so it's going to take a few minutes for everyone to orient themselves. The whole session is going to be recorded, which is also why I asked you to turn your video off, so it's just Dr. Curry and I who will be, our faces in these little boxes will be videotaped, and you'll be able to share and access this video, later on. I'll be sending out the link to your emails afterwards. So we are going to get started in just a moment. I am looking at other places people are from. Castleton, New York. We got a lot from Binghamton. That's wonderful. And Dutchess County. So we have begun a series of webinars, which are really just video conversations with great TESOLers across New York State who are involved in all kinds of different aspects of our field, focusing on English learners of varied levels with different research agendas. And this is a great way for us to become a community of practice outside of the conference. I hope you are putting in your proposals. The deadline is May 15th. We'd love to see you in White Plains in November for our 49th annual New York State TESOL conference. So we are going to begin. I am going to be looking at your questions. So anytime you have a question about what Dr. Curry is going to share, feel free to post it in the chat box. She's going to speak for about 20, 25 minutes, share her work with us. She's going to introduce herself, her background, and then after her presentation, we'll have a time to look through the questions and she can interact with us and share her responses. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary Jane Curry, or she's called MJ Curry. If you've ever submitted to the TESOL Quarterly, you've probably seen her name as a section editor, and we are delighted that she's taking the time to speak with us from the University of Rochester. So I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura, and thanks again for inviting me to participate in a webinar. I have to confess it's the first webinar that I have given, so it's a little bit to get used to the technology. And I want to thank my doctoral students who were kind enough to take time out of their busy end of semester semester and dissertation writing moments to review my slides and give me some really good feedback. And I know some of them are even online, which is great that they're taking the time. And I also want to thank all the participants for taking time. It's such a busy time of year for everybody. And I'm really honored that you chose to spend an hour of it with us. So let's see if I can figure out how to get to the next slide. Don't know. Oh, this is the problem we had earlier. All right, let me try something different.
No problem.
Wait, you don't, I'm the one who's controlling the slides, right? Okay, there we go. I found the right arrow. Okay, well, technology is not my forte.
Success, we did it. We're on to the next slide.
So, just a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, I saw a lot of familiar names on that list. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Teaching and Curriculum and the Warner Graduate School of Education and Human Development. And I'm just finishing up my 15th year here. And the first 11 years, I directed our master's programs with certification programs in TESOL and foreign language, and also created an international TESOL master's program. So I've been heavily involved in teacher ed, and I'm now focusing more on working with doctoral students. I also direct our writing support services, which is something I started when I came here. And overall, in many different ways, my research and my teaching have been focusing on academic literacy, and in specific, I've been interested in how people gain access to academic literacy at different moments in the whole academic trajectory as a key resource for success in higher education. And obviously for English language learners, we're talking about both linguistic competence, rhetorical knowledge, cultural knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, and I'm going to try to address those different strands as I go through my presentation. History, and I worked as an editor and project manager for 8 years, and then I decided to get my master's in TESOL at UMass Boston, which was a phenomenal place to go. And I became very interested in immigrant and refugee students and first-generation students. And when I did my PhD, I did a study, semester-long ethnographic study of a basic writing class at a community college. I was interested in what the experiences of immigrant and refugee students were. And that was enlightening, because one of the things it showed me was that if you have a complete mismatch between the students and the curriculum, we're talking about adults who are in higher ed, and they're not going to waste their time on things that are not useful for them. And so in that study, one of the major findings was just that students left. Students are not going to take things that don't help them. And then when I finished my doctorate and I started my first job as a researcher, I actually jumped to the other end of the spectrum to look at academic publishing by multilingual scholars, and to some extent by students, and increasingly graduate student literacy has become a focus of my work. And also been expanding in terms of disciplines and done some work on engineers writing for publication. So it's all connected. I think it's actually quite interesting how connected all of it is across that whole span. Okay, so when we talk about English language learners in higher ed as students, and I think not a one-size-fits-all approach to supporting students, and there's so much more involved in learning academic literacy than just knowing English or knowing any language. So we have immigrant students, refugee students, and people will know that those are already different types of experiences, although they're often categorized together. Generation 1.5 students, where they are probably bi or multilingual, but have mostly grown up in the US or have grown up in the US at some part of their K-12 experience. International undergraduates, international graduate students, and in cases, postdoctoral research fellows. So again, we're talking about a pretty broad span. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these groups. Here I'm kind of lumping together the first few. As I said, the immigrant, refugee, and Generation 1.5 students in higher ed probably have had some K-12 school experience, but we know that that experience can be extremely variable, and they may or may not have been given the kinds of experiences and knowledge about academic discourse and the expectations of higher ed that they need to to be able to succeed. They may still be learning conversational and academic language. They are probably building disciplinary content knowledge, and they're most likely learning what's called the hidden curriculum of higher education, which has to do with all of the social practices of understanding how to navigate in higher education. What are faculty office hours? Where do you go for help? When do you go for help? When do you ask questions? All these kinds of things that middle class and students who've grown up in the US tend to take for granted, that they have the right to get what they need. And a lot of times immigrant and refugee students don't always understand that they should be asking for the help that they need. International undergraduates, when I was in school, used to be a more predictable group, and now what we're seeing is an increasing number are attending high school in the United States as international students. And then still we have probably the majority who are coming from overseas, but we're starting to see, I don't know if in other locations, but I know in Rochester we're starting to get international high school students in a lot of our private schools. These international undergraduates are learning how to do college, how to be college students, but in a new culture, while they're improving their English and while they're developing content knowledge. Even if they do pre-sessional ESOL programs, summer programs, or semester programs, they still have a lot of academic literacy that they need to learn. Again, international graduate students is also a changing population. In the past, many of them would have been educated in their home countries, and they still are. Those systems of education are often quite different than ours, and they may not highlight academic literacy, which I'm going to talk in a second, but that would include classroom participation, a lot of writing, and things that test-oriented systems of education tend to minimize. We are also seeing, though, the increasing number of graduate students who went to U.S. undergraduate schools, so they're getting more experience earlier. Sometimes we include postdoctoral fellows in this group as well, and some places will support them better than others. It's actually a conversation that's happening here at the University of Rochester at the moment. Okay, so I've already switched a little bit between the term literacy and literacies, and I wanted to just do one slide of theoretical orientation, because this is really central to the way that I think about academic discourses of different types and academic literacy in a larger sense. There's a term, academic literacies, which is a theoretical and practical orientation that originated in the United Kingdom. And it comes out of anthropology and literacy as social practice. So it's looking at literacy as patterns of behavior, ways that literacy is used in different contexts, rather than literacy as skills. So if you think about the whole language debate, the bottom-up, top-down, this is really looking at how people make meaning in different contexts in predictable, not rigid, but sort of routinized ways. And if we think about literacy in that way, then it shows us that it's always based in specific contexts. In academic literacy, generally based in academic disciplines. It's always using particular resources that are related to the context. It always involves learners' identities, and it always involves power relationships. And most obviously, we have power relationships in a classroom between the teacher and the students. But when you get into graduate school, you have power relations with your advisor, with your committee, and those can play a very big role in how students navigate and how they do or don't succeed in higher education. The demands of literacy in higher education, and I keep talking about literacy rather than writing per se, because really it's important to think about this all as a whole, that students are doing a lot of reading, a lot of high-level, abstract, concrete in the disciplinary sense, very specific disciplinary terms, etc. They're probably doing a lot more writing. They're expected to communicate in classroom activities orally, and increasingly academic literacies involves digital communications, for example, a webinar, but there are increasing numbers of modes like academic blogging, tweeting. One of my students last night was talking about Twitter for disseminating research. There's all kinds of developments in terms of how people are communicating about their academic work. What we know about courses for students is that developmental first year writing courses or ESL writing courses are often not grounded in disciplinary content or disciplinary knowledge practices. And this has been a big source of tension in the academic writing community or the composition community, really asking the question, to what extent do initial courses that students are taking prepare them for disciplinary writing practices? In the disciplines, they're not only writing for learning, they're also writing to develop their knowledge and demonstrate the knowledge that they're making, and therefore also for assessment. So writing has, in some ways, a more high stakes value in their disciplinary courses, and ultimately, if they're writing capstone projects, writing becomes extremely important for things like a master's thesis, final projects, portfolios in teacher education, dissertations, etc. And as I mentioned, we have a pretty strong expectation in many of our higher education classes that students should be participating in classroom activities, and in many cases they're graded on classroom participation. So if we think about academic literacies as including all of those activities and practices, but also understanding that when they're getting into their disciplinary courses, that all of those activities have a very specific grounding in the practices of the discipline. So texts, for example, are going to be different in the sciences compared with humanities, etc. It's really a neglected area, but increasingly the research is demonstrating that students' critical engagement with academic texts plays a large role in their ability to from that point, make their own meaning and communicate it through writing and oral communication and digital literacies. As students go along the academic trajectory, they're required not only to be reading for knowledge, to take information out of a text, but also to be able to analyze the text, to identify arguments, understand how methodology is used in a text, understand how theory is used in a text, and also to relate texts to each other. Then when they go into the writing mode based on those sources, they need not only to summarize them, but to synthesize them and often to give their own views on the reading. So really, as students are engaging more and more deeply with the communication demands of their disciplines, they are asked to do more sophisticated and critical kind of expert stances they have to take. And these are very difficult to develop, and they take a long time to develop. There's two main aspects of disciplinary academic literacies that I want to talk about today. And the first one is genres, which is probably a term you're familiar with. And another way of thinking of it is types of text. And these are often variable across disciplines. And what can be very confusing for students is that sometimes we call them the same thing. So one professor, even within a department or a school, might call something a critical commentary and expect something very different than another professor who uses the same term. Of course, we have other genres that are more predictable, like a lab report, book review, but even so, there's a lot of variation. And I think there's often a lot of confusion generated when content professors, disciplinary professors, don't understand that they need to explain and illustrate what they're looking for when they label an assignment. And I think one thing, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, one thing that we can do as people supporting students in writing is help them understand when they should be asking questions. Because these disciplinary genres are situated practices, one thing we can do is help them understand how these genres work within their own disciplines. Now, I'll talk at the end about the need to collaborate. Sometimes we don't know how they work, but they can take this on as a kind of ethnographic project. This is something Ann Johns proposed a couple of decades ago. So one possibility here is to have students do a kind of list or taxonomy of every different kind of assignment they're asked to write, the different modes that their discipline is using, and then think about how they can deconstruct or analyze those assignments. The other key term I want to talk about is register, and register is a fancy name for the specialized forms of language and other semiotic resources like graphics, or in a digital space, video, audio, that are used for specific purposes. And here we have formal academic language, general academic vocabulary, specific disciplinary terminology, and then all of the kind of non-verbal, non-textual aspects of text, like what mode are you using, what kind of format are you using, and of course our favorite, what's the referencing style. And so if you think about what it is that students need to start to synthesize and take on board and really internalize, it's really a lot that we're asking them to do. Okay, so how do we support them? As I mentioned, I think increasingly my own teaching practice, and I think in general, I'm really recommending that we start with reading. In higher ed, students are usually shifting into not only having to write a lot more, but also having to read a lot more. And as I mentioned before, they're not reading only for the purpose of identifying information or taking information uncritically as consumers, but they have to learn how to engage with critical reading practices. So one strategy that people have found successful is to actually model a critical reading practice where the instructor actually takes a text and will do a kind of think aloud protocol as she reads. And so students can get a sense of how a more experienced reader is engaging with the text. It's a way of highlighting the different aspects of the text, including things that students may not think about, like what does a title do? What is the work of a title? If you're reading research articles, why bother to read the abstract? How do you even see where a journal name is? What does that mean? Things like that, which I find that even a lot of our doctoral students are not really sensitive to all of these kind of textual framing devices. Another strategy I think is super important is to just do as much writing as possible in each class meeting. And I'm a big proponent of low stakes, non-graded writing incorporated into my classes. So my students will be laughing because there's almost no class where I won't have them do a free write. And it will be 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Most of the time they will then discuss what they've written with a partner, but sometimes it's just write and then we're going to move on. So I do a lot of free writing with them, brainstorming as a class, mapping out of ideas. It doesn't have to be a linear kind of thing. Whatever mode works for folks is really productive. And then helping them through discussion of the ideas to start to articulate what they're talking about. Another thing, I didn't put this up here, but one of my favorite activities is to have the kind of speed dating or dyadic belt where students have to have 1 minute or 2 minutes to summarize the main argument of a paper, and then they move on and talk about it with another student. And so they can end up talking to 8 or 10 students, depending on the size of the class, about the same idea over and over again. And it really helps them to refine their argument. Another important thing I think is for students to see us as instructors, as writers, as sometimes struggling writers, to share our own writing experiences with them and our own practices. So I will talk with them about the struggles that I have in finding time to write. I will talk with students about the fact that I might have 20 drafts of an article before I submit it to publication, and I show them on my computer the folder where I have those drafts. So, and I share, as my doctoral students know, I share journal reviews, I share rejection letters, I've shared a major revise and resubmit with them. I don't want them to think that I have all the answers and that it's all super easy for me. I want them to see that writing is a challenging task for everybody, and that, you know, you're always starting fresh. And I think it's helpful from an emotional perspective for students to realize that this is not, you know, you can learn how to ride a bike and you can keep your skill level fairly constant, but when you're writing academic texts, it's always challenging. Some of the more specific recommendations that I would make for scaffolding writing in your classes, starting with articulating your expectations, writing out assignment descriptions, even for a brief For example, and I say on the slide below here, creating scaffolds for larger assignments. So I almost always, when I have a large paper due in a course, I will have these different stages due throughout the semester. Students have to write a paper proposal, they have to write an outline, they submit drafts for peer review, they submit a draft to me, and they usually revise their draft. So for almost every stage, I actually write a description of what I'm looking for. For the culminating final project, I generally provide a rubric. And to the extent possible, if it's an assignment that I've assigned before, I ask permission from students who have done a really good job to use those papers as exemplars for the future. And I put those up on my course Blackboard site. And I like to use multiple examples because that's a way of showing that there's many different ways to meet the expectations of the assignment. There's no one right way. I'm a big believer in the whole process writing approach, especially for academic writing. I think there's a lot of final text and then getting my feedback on it and then engaging with the text again. Not always as good as I sound on saving the focus on mechanics for later, but that is the goal. And certainly what process writing advocates like Peter Elbow would talk about is really focus on the meaning at the earlier stages. Sorry, I did want to say, this must come later. There are some strategies, though, for focusing on mechanics, which I think is in 2 slides from now, I hope. Another practice, which I think is really important, I mentioned a little bit earlier, is to collaborate on providing support. So I think for students, particularly who are new to higher education and academic literacies in higher education, is to help them investigate the literacy requirements of their content courses. So I know that there's many different kinds of people on this, listening to this webinar, that some of you may be working in more entry-level writing courses where you're helping students with their assignments for their content courses. And so there I would say any assignments that help them either from a kind of ethnographic perspective or just as a more informal way, asking professors for more information about what they're looking for will help them understand the genres that they're being asked to write. If you can actually incorporate some of their assignments or examples from their other classes into English for academic purposes classes, I think that's another good way of having really authentic texts and authentic practices represented in the work of your class. And I think it's valuable. It can be time consuming and there can be resistance, but I think it's really valuable to work with the content instructors to talk to them about what could be helpful for making their requirements and their expectations explicit for students. In fact, I've learned from some students here that one of the things they would like to have, which I haven't quite managed to get to myself, is guiding questions for the readings that they're doing in advance of the class period when they're due. So that's actually something I'm hoping to try to do next year as I update my syllabi, is to think in advance and give them a couple of questions the week ahead of when the readings are due to help guide their reading. Here's the slide I was looking for, responding to student work. So for these different scaffolds that I was mentioning before, those are good moments for both the student and the reviewer, whether it's the peer reviewer or the instructor, to focus on the ideas, the argument and development, the structure of the text, rather than on mechanics. If you have time to conference with students about their ideas and how they're developing it, that can be very time consuming, and depending on the size of classes, it's not always possible. In responding to text, this is old advice from Mina Shaughnessy and lots of other people to respond to patterns of non-standard usage of language rather than correcting every error. In my case, unfortunately, my editing background tends to interfere with that goal, but that is a good goal. And another task or approach, which I do sometimes do for reasons of time, is just make some corrections or some feedback on sample paragraphs where you can see that the student's going to have patterns that can be repeated throughout the text, and then ask the writer to think about how to apply those kinds of changes to the text, to the rest of the text. That's the end. Sorry, I didn't realize this ended so quickly. So there's some references if you're interested in any. These are a few of the publications that I've worked on. Most specifically, most recently, this book, that really nice book that was edited, published by the University of Michigan Press, called Supporting Graduate Student Writers. And then some of my other work on publishing, and one of the earliest things I collaborated on, which is a book for people teaching academic writing. But it's aimed mostly at a UK audience, but it has a lot of useful information. So that's what I have to share for the moment. And thank you for listening. And Laura, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. There was a lot of information packed in there, and we have a good number of questions. So I'm going to just throw a few your way.
Okay.
One was, about the free writing that you talked about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because I think people were really gratified to see you using free writing in higher ed. And could you talk a little about that in terms of making it timed or untimed, or how does it feel radical to do that? And how do you kind of normalize that and what's the rationale for it?
Yeah. Well, I think the rationale is that free writing, so the theory of free writing is that, and those of you who know, the famous affective filter hypothesis from Crash in 1985, mm-hmm. The theory is that our anxiety, whether it's about language production or writing, can really inhibit our brain's ability to actually produce what we want it to produce. And the idea of free writing is really just to get out of the way of your brain. And I use it in all my courses. I do teach a doctoral level writing course, but I use it really in all my courses as a writing for learning kind of thing. And it also helps focus students. So I do give a prompt. Sometimes I give multiple prompts so that people can choose. Sometimes the prompt will just be something like, how are you feeling about your ability to find the research that you need for your literature review? Or, where are you feeling stuck? Process, a lot of process. Sometimes, though, I will ask them, I'm just thinking about some of the prompts I gave in my doctoral writing class this semester. What information do you think your audience might need to know about your topic before, for your introduction? In some of my master's courses that are more focused for teacher education and other students, I will often have readings that are more connected, writing prompts that are more connected to the course readings. Mm-hmm. So I teach a course that's kind of like a baby sociolinguistics course, and so I might have them talk about their own experience of multilingualism, or their own experience of being in a context where they weren't using their first language, those kinds of things. I think it's just a way to kind of get loosen up their brains, get them started. One of the assignments in that master's level course is actually to write their own autoethnography of a literacy or language experience. And the free writing can just be a way to start writing it and see if it's a direction they want to explore. I give a prompt. I do it often so they expect it. And I do follow the rules of it's private. I've never collected them. I used to kind of yell at people if they weren't writing. I sort of backed off of that a little bit. But that was kind of the early. I learned this from Vivian Zamel at UMass Boston. So talk about one of the early academic writing, second language writing folks. I will often ask them to share some thoughts from their writing, but I will never ask them to share their writing. And I've had a lot of comments in student evaluations where they loved it. I've had people say, and then, doctoral students who say, this is the only way I made it through whatever consequential text they're working on at the moment. But the basic rules, you're writing for a short, limited time. You're not supposed to stop writing. You can use whatever language you want. So I tell them, if you don't want to use English, you can use whatever language. And if they really don't want to do it, I just say, just keep writing. This is a waste of time. This is a waste of time. And I don't know if anyone's ever done that, but yeah.
That's great. I love that you encourage, the writing process, even obviously using the native language, so important to loosen up the ideas. Okay, a different kind of question. Plagiarism.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, have you found any helpful ways to address it, maybe preempt it, or, because that's ideal?
Well, I actually think that this scaffolded approach to larger assignments is a very important way. To be honest, I'm not somebody who's overly concerned about plagiarism, and it may be because I'm only teaching graduate students. It's not that we don't have it, but it's much less likely that somebody's going to be finding a paper online that they can submit. It's really more, their writing is sort of self-scaffolding over time, ideally. But if students are writing a one-page proposal to write a paper for me, first of all, I've been reading academic texts for a very long time, and I know the difference between a student's sentence and a professional sentence.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do, and this is a little time consuming, and I probably should just have them use Turnitin, but if I'm reading a text and I feel like there's 5 or 6 words that I'm pretty sure the student didn't write, I just copy those and put them into Google, and 9 times out of 10, the source comes up. Sometimes it's a source that they've cited, and that shows me that they don't really understand the difference between citing and quoting and paraphrasing, and that's a developmental stage. And so I will just highlight it. I will just highlight what's in the original text and take the citation and put it in a comment that says, this phrase came directly from this source. This could be considered plagiarism. You need to work on, whatever. You need to work on all of these things. And most of the time, the students have claimed, I don't really know what they're thinking, but they have claimed that they're shocked, this is a mistake, they didn't intend, and they learn, and they don't do it again. I know there have been examples of plagiarism in our school where students have used other students' papers or, something that's more intentional and egregious, but I have not had that problem myself.
I think scaffolding is a big part of it, because then it's, obviously plagiarism is that compensatory strategy when you didn't feel you could do it. So when you enable the student, empower them. So let me go to a different question. I think you had talked earlier about helping them walk through summarizing different articles. And so one of the questions from one of the viewers was, when you do that, do you have everyone work on different articles, or are they working on the same one, or do you use one as an anchor and then they go to their own, or?
I have a real resistance to having, especially because remember, I'm only working with graduate students. I have a real resistance to having them do what I think of as exercises versus authentic tasks. So, and also I have a luxury that in my writing class, for example, we're capped at 16 and we're often at 10 or 12. So this course focuses a whole semester on writing a literature review at the doctoral level. So they're each starting with identifying a topic, finding research literature. Our librarian comes in to work with them. So I asked them to choose, this semester I had them summarize 3 articles. Sometimes it's been 1 or 2. And I just asked them to choose an article and write a summary of it for me, that I haven't read the article. And so I need to be able to get a clear enough understanding of the article from a one-page summary. Sometimes that's where some of the plagiarism will show up, because that's where I can see that they haven't fully understood the difference between paraphrasing and citing and quoting. I don't know if it would be more effective to have everybody do the same one and then have us look at them, but I feel like I might lose my mind if I had to read them all. So I guess I've sacrificed.
It creates authenticity for you, because you're reading it really to find out, as opposed to another one of the same.
Exactly. I do think I'm going to change. I'm going to add a stage of, next time I teach that course next fall, is to take those 3 articles and write a synthesis, because that actually at the doctoral level, probably at lower levels too, turns out to be the most challenging aspect for students for writing a literature review.
Yes, they are challenging. Just maybe, I'm not sure if we have time for 2 more questions, but one of the questions I think a lot of people are interested in is, what's your take on peer feedback in the writing classroom?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, I'm only working with graduate students.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the one hand, because they're reading the same assignment that they've been grappling with themselves, in principle, they should know the requirements of the assignment. I tell them to refer to the syllabus when they do the peer review, and I sometimes give them guiding questions for a specific assignment. Students claim that they get a lot out of it. I have not done any kind of experiment where I have, not done it and seen how the writing is. I feel like, especially for doctoral students, it's a good professional practice for them to learn how to read other people's texts and try to give useful feedback. Yeah, so I kind of feel like I'm doing it without really knowing if it's effective, but I do know that students say they enjoy it and they get something out of it. So
It's
it's
more around the ideas, and it's not, again, working at the mechanics level.
exactly right.
Okay. And then lastly, any suggestions for online tools that you recommend to students?
Well, our Writing Support Services has a resources page, and this is open to the public, where we just link to various, people probably know there's the Purdue Online Writing Lab, which has tons of resources. Grammarly. We also have a page of freelancers you can hire to help you with your writing, that we're not responsible for. There's a lot of information online. There's a lot of very good information online. So one thing I'm doing with 6 graduate students, some of whom are probably online right now, is we're writing a book that University of Michigan Press is going to publish, called An A to W of Academic Writing for Graduate Students. And one of the reviewers of the proposal said, why would a person buy this book rather than just Googling all the terms they want to know? Which is a fantastic question for us as writers, because it makes us think about what else are we offering besides definitions. But it really does show you, even on Wikipedia, you can get a lot of information about a genres. What is a lit review? What is a whatever? So I think the thing is, though, that students need to understand a generic description of any genre or any practice has to be refracted through what's happening in the specific discipline they're in, or the specific course they're taking, or the specific genre they're writing at a given moment. Because, we know that a dissertation proposal is different than a dissertation. You don't just flip the chapters of a dissertation proposal over into a dissertation. Sorry, guys. But, there are sometimes subtle changes in the way we write things depending on where we are with the particular project.
I think our time is basically up. You see, she shared her email here, which is very generous. If you wanted to share some of your feedback or questions later, and I think it was really interesting because obviously. New York State TESOL, as a professional association of English language educators in New York State, we are at all levels from kindergarten through adult, post-secondary, but we actually have a lot more in common than different. All of us who are in K-12, this is very familiar kinds of concerns and approaches. I think it's fabulous to see them mirrored in higher ed, because sometimes the higher ed setting can be a little, not in the English language teaching, but in the discipline areas, can be a little slower in the pedagogy, let's say, than K-12, because obviously they're not trained to be teachers.
Exactly.
Their subjects matter special. So when you talked about connecting with the particular disciplinary literacy needs across the content areas, and even front-loading some of the type of reading work. So using your position as an English language educator to support your learners, obviously, across the disciplinary challenges they have. Like you said, the different genres and then the different demands of those content areas is something that we all are working on in U.S. English as a second language settings.
Mhm.
So I want to really, really thank you so much. This was very rich, very informative. We had wonderful feedback on the group chat. And I want to just do a plug again for if you're not yet a member of New York State TESOL, become part of this community. We are fabulous, brilliant, and we support each other. And I will be sending you information about the conference, putting in a proposal. If you do something with writing, share it at the conference and attend the conference and engage with us. So I'll be in touch with you all online, and everyone is really looking forward to looking at your PowerPoint later. So thank you so much, Dr. Curry, and have a great afternoon in Rochester and from New York City. I hope to see you all again. Next month, May, we have our next webinar is with Dr. Carla Meskel, and she works in online language teach, so CALL, computer-assisted language learning. So she'll be talking about that. So thanks again, and take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Bye.